The air within the grand synod of the Galactic Concordat tasted of ozone, recycled nitrogen, and the acrid, metallic tang of ancient despair. It was not merely the physical atmosphere of the station, a colossal, torus-shaped construct orbiting the dying neutron star of Typhon 9, but the psychic weight of 1,000 civilizations facing their collective twilight. The high vaulted ceilings, crafted from translucent biocrystalline panels that usually shimmered with the violet light of the nebula outside, were dimmed to a somber gray, reflecting the mood of the delegates gathered below. There were no shouts, no panicked screams, for the species represented here were the elders of the galaxy, the architects of Dyson spheres and the weavers of hyperlanes, and they did not scream when the end came. They debated the precise mathematics of their extinction. High Exarch Valkyor of the Cygnus Dominion sat upon his levitating dais, his 4 articulated arms resting heavily on the obsidian control interface, his compound eyes twitching with a mixture of exhaustion and suppressed rage. He looked out over the amphitheater, seeing the diverse biology of the Concordat's member states, the gelatinous, silicate-based Thalorians encased in their pressure suits, the avian, hollow-boned Ethari with their plumage dulled by stress, and the monolithic, stone-skinned Grak who sat like statues of mourning. They were the masters of the known universe, possessors of technology that could reshape matter at the atomic level, yet they were paralyzed by a threat that defied their logic and consumed their energy. The enemy, a name they had given to the phenomenon for lack of a better term, though some called it the Great Silence or the Entropy Tide, was not a fleet of ships, nor a biological plague, but a resonance, a cascading wave of anthologic that tore through advanced circuitry and energy matrices like a storm through paper. It targeted complexity. It targeted the very pinnacle of their achievements. Where they had built quantum shields, the enemy unraveled the superposition of particles. Where they had constructed antimatter reactors, the enemy inverted the containment fields. The more advanced the technology, the faster it burned. And so the Grand Synod had become a funeral procession, a gathering of kings and emperors watching their borders recede, system by system, as the silence drew nearer. Valkyor cleared his throat, a sound that amplified through the acoustic manipulation of the chamber, silencing the low murmur of subvocal communications. He felt the weight of the Cygnus Dominion's history, 10,000 years of starfaring glory, crumbling into dust. He had called this emergency session not to plan a counterattack, for every fleet sent against the tide had simply ceased to exist, their signals vanishing into the static, but to discuss the final evacuation protocols, the preservation of genetic archives in deep space vaults that might, millions of years hence, be found by some primitive race crawling out of the mud. The latest reports from the rim sectors are unequivocal, Valkyor stated, his voice a synthesized rasp that carried the authority of an emperor yet the defeat of a broken man. The Tyrian buffer zone has collapsed. The automated defense grid of the Kale Imperium has gone dark. The tide accelerates. Our models predict that the inner sanctum of the Concordat, this very station and the core worlds we protect, will fall within 3 standard cycles. We have no weapons that can harm it. We have no shields that can repel it. We are the apex of evolution, and we are being undone by a cosmic negation of our own advancement. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air, a physical pressure that seemed to crush the lungs of every being present. A ripple of unease moved through the assembly, a shifting of bodies and a flickering of bioluminescent displays. Then from the lower tiers of the amphitheater, a voice arose, discordant, harsh, vibrating with a frustration that broke the solemn decorum. It was Subminister Zalthal of the scientific caste, a being whose cranial implants glowed with the frantic processing of data. "There is still the matter of the invitation," Zalthal interjected, his voice trembling not with fear, but with the indignation of a logician forced to consider the absurd. "We sent the displacement beacons. We invoked the Treaty of the Gray Void. We called for every sentient species capable of interstellar flight to rally at Typhon 9. The manifest is incomplete." Valkyor's mandibles clicked in irritation. He knew to whom the subminister referred. It was a topic of minor embarrassment and major annoyance that had plagued the Concordat for the last century. "You refer to the Terrans," Valkyor said, dismissing the name with a wave of his upper hand. "The humans, the primitives from the Orion arm. Why do you waste the Synod's dying breaths on them? They are barely a Type 1 civilization by our standards. They rely on combustion, on kinetic impact, on crude fission. They have not even mastered zero-point energy. What could they possibly contribute to a war that has consumed the Ethari Solar Guard? They are an anomaly," Zalthul insisted, his holographic projector flaring to life, displaying a rotating map of the galaxy. A small, insignificant sector on the edge was highlighted in amber. They accepted the beacon. They responded, but their transmission was archaic. Analog radio waves, binary code. It took our translation algorithms nearly a cycle just to decipher the static. They said they were coming. They said they were bringing the old guard. We have not seen them since the border skirmishes of the Seventh Age, where they refused to integrate into the Concordat trade network. We dismissed them as isolationists, as backward savages clinging to their dirtball worlds, but the sensors on the perimeter, they are picking up something. Valkyoer leaned forward, his interest piqued only by the sheer desperation of the moment. What do you mean, picking up something? The enemy masks all sensor readings. We are blind beyond the Typhon heliopause. Zalthul's manipulator limbs danced over his console. Not the enemy, High Exarch, a distortion, a gravitational wake so clumsy, so massive, and so inefficient that it is cutting through the background interference like a hammer through glass. It is not a warp signature. It is not a hyperspace fold. It is barely controlled physics. It is brute force, and it is arriving now. As if on cue, the entire station shuddered. It was not the subtle vibration of a docking clamp engaging, nor the rhythmic hum of the station-keeping thrusters. It was a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the hull plates, shaking the delicate crystal spires of the synod chamber. The delegates looked up in alarm as the massive viewing dome above them, a continuous field of transparent hyperdiamond, shifted its focus from the swirling nebula to the local space surrounding the station. The darkness of space was usually punctuated by the sleek, luminescent silhouettes of Concordat vessels, ships of flowing lines, energy sails, and silent propulsion. But what tore through the fabric of real space at that moment was an affront to aesthetic and aerodynamic sensibilities alike. It was a tear, a jagged rupture in the vacuum, accompanied by a flare of Cherenkov radiation that blinded the visual sensors for a microsecond. When the optical filters adjusted, a collective gasp, translated into 100 different languages, swept through the hall. Emerging from the rift were not ships of light and grace. They were mountains of steel. They were jagged, ugly, industrial nightmares. Great slabs of gray armor plating, scarred and pitted, welded together in blocky, utilitarian shapes that screamed of primitive metallurgy. They spewed exhaust, actual particulate matter, gas, and fire from massive, bell-shaped thruster cones at their rear. There were no energy shields shimmering around them. Instead, they were bristling with physical protrusions, antennae arrays, sensor dishes, and most horrifyingly, gun barrels. Massive, rifled cannons that looked like archaic, distinct artillery pieces, missile pods the size of skyscrapers, and railgun batteries that extended for kilometers along the flanks of the lead vessels. They moved with a lumbering, heavy momentum, their engines burning with the crude fury of nuclear fire. "By the progenitors," whispered the Ithari delegate, covering his eyes with a wing. "They are flying junk heaps. They are museums. Is this a joke? Is this the Terran idea of aid?" Valkyoer stared at the screen, his logical mind struggling to categorize what he was seeing. There were hundreds of them, a flotilla of rust and iron. They bore names painted in white letters on their hulls, names from a language of conquerors and poets. UNSC Everest asterisk, asterisk Stalingrad asterisk, Iron Duke asterisk, asterisk Yamato Roman II asterisk, Thunderchild asterisk. They did not glide, they pushed the universe out of their way. They leaked radiation. They bled heat. They were loud in the electromagnetic spectrum, a cacophony of analog chatter and mechanical noise. "Communication incoming," the station AI announced, its voice devoid of the disdain the delegates felt. "Audio only, narrowband frequency, high static content." Valkyoer gestured for the channel to be opened, preparing himself to chastise the humans for bringing their waste into the sacred space of the Concordat's final stand. The speakers crackled, a hiss of white noise that sounded like rain on a tin roof before a voice cut through. It was not synthesized, it was human, it was old, ragged, and undeniably calm. "This is Admiral Silas Thorne of the United Earth Coalition," the voice said. "Apologies for the delay, High Council, we had to dust them off. We hear you have a bit of a bug problem." Valkyoer suppressed the urge to sever the connection. "Admiral Thorne," he replied, his tone dripping with icy formality. "You stand before the Grand Synod of the Galaxy. We are facing an extinction-level event caused by an entity that devours advanced energy signatures. And you have brought us scrap metal. These vessels are obsolete. They are hazardous. Your presence here is a mockery of our plight. We requested fleets. We requested power. You bring us combustion engines and projectile throwers." There was a pause on the line, filled only by the hum of the human background noise. "Obsolete," Thorne repeated, tasting the word. That's one word for it. We prefer proven. You see, Exarch, we've been watching, we've been listening. You folks built your empires on the idea that newer is better, that light beats matter, that logic beats grit, but we humans, we're sentimental. We don't throw things away just because we invented something shinier. We keep the old tools in the shed, because sometimes you don't need a laser scalpel to cut a knot. Sometimes you need a rusty knife. This enemy consumes energy matrices, Valkgoer snapped, losing his patience. It feeds on quantum computation. Your ships, primitive as they are, surely rely on computers. They will be dead in the water the moment the tide arrives. You have doomed your crews for a gesture of vanity. We'll see, Thorne said, and his voice went cold, shedding the grandfatherly warmth. The Everest is running on vacuum tubes and hydraulic backups. Our targeting computers are analog. Our reactor shielding is lead and concrete, not magnetic containment. There's no network for your ghost to hack, no energy shield for it to eat, just 20 meters of ablative titanium and enough ordnance to crack a planet. You asked for help, Exarch. We're here to hold the line. I suggest you pull your pretty glass ships behind our wake. It's going to get loud. Before Valkgoer could respond, the sensors screamed. The tide had arrived. It appeared at the edge of the system not as a fleet, but as a shadow. A creeping darkness that blotted out the stars, a distortion in the visual field that made the eyes water and the mind reel. It was a cloud of nanite dust and coherent energy fields, a sentient storm that swept forward with terrifying speed. The Concordat's perimeter drones, advanced automated sentinels armed with plasma lances, were the first to meet it. The moment the tide touched them, they didn't explode. They simply ceased to function. Their lights died, their reactors drained instantly, and their hulls began to dissolve, the molecular bonds unraveling as the enemy feasted on the high-energy lattice of their construction. "Shields up!" Valkgoer roared, though he knew it was futile. The station's massive energy barriers flared to life, a golden dome of protective force. But the tide surged forward, drawn to the shield like a moth to a flame. The barrier flickered, turned violet, and then shattered, the feedback loop overloading the station's main capacitors. Sparks rained down in the synod chamber as consoles exploded. The lights died, replaced by the red glare of emergency strobes. "It is over," the Thalorian delegate wailed, his suit liquefying in panic. "The silence comes." "Look!" Zalthal shouted, pointing at the view screen which was now running on auxiliary battery power. Between the defenseless station and the encroaching darkness, the human fleet was moving. They did not retreat. They did not flank. They accelerated directly into the teeth of the storm. The UNSC Everest Asterisk, a leviathan of gray steel, vented a massive plume of chemical fire from its maneuvering thrusters, turning its broadside toward the tide. "Fire!" Thorne's voice came over the comms, no longer addressing the aliens but commanding his own people. The result was not a beam of light. It was a thunderclap that propagated even through the vacuum, carried by the sheer density of the exhaust gases. The human ships erupted in flashes of muzzle fire. Thousands of kinetic rounds, tungsten slugs the size of shuttlecraft, depleted uranium shells, and explosive-tipped ballistic missiles were hurled into the void. It was a storm of matter. There was no energy signature for the tide to latch onto, no frequency to jam. It was simply cold, hard Newton's third law delivered with apocalyptic fury. The synod watched in stunned silence as the projectiles slammed into the tide. The enemy, accustomed to absorbing lasers and unraveling plasma, had no defense against a 20-ton block of tungsten moving at a fraction of the speed of light. The kinetic impactors tore through the cloud, shattering the cohesive fields of the nanite swarms. Missiles detonated deep within the shadowy mass, their chemical warheads triggering nuclear fireballs that expanded in blinding spheres of radiation. The tide recoiled. For the first time in the history of the war, the enemy did not absorb the attack, it was broken by it. They are hurting it," Valkgoer stammered, his mandibles hanging open. "How that?" "Weaponry is archaic, it is barbaric." "It is matter," Zalthal whispered, his eyes wide with awe. "The enemy feeds on order, it feeds on complex energy states, but a bullet is just a rock with purpose. The enemy cannot hack a rock, it cannot drain the battery of a chemically propelled shell. The humans, they have brought the one thing the enemy cannot consume. They have brought physics." The battle that ensued was not a graceful dance of starships, it was a brawl. The human ships took hits, glancing blows from the energy tendrils of the tide that scorched their armor and melted their sensors. But they did not lose power. They did not shut down. When a laser array was sheared off the Asterisk Iron Duke, the crew simply switched to manual optical targeting and kept firing. When the reactor of the Asterisk Stalingrad was compromised, they didn't eject the core. They vented the heat into space and kept the guns fed. It was a display of resilience that terrified the Concordat delegates almost as much as the enemy did. The humans fought with a savagery that was entirely alien to the refined sensibilities of the galaxy. They rammed the smaller clusters of the tide. They detonated flak screens of shrapnel that shredded the delicate nanites. They filled space with so much debris and fire that the enemy's cohesion began to falter. Valkor watched the tactical display, seeing the red smear of the tide fragmenting under the relentless hammering of the obsolete fleet. He saw the humans taking casualties, ships buckling under the strain, hulls rupturing, but for every human ship that fell, they took a piece of the enemy with them. It was a war of attrition, and the humans were spending their lives like currency with a cold, terrifying generosity. "Thorn," Valkor said, his voice humbled. "Your fleet, you are taking heavy damage. You must pull back. We can route power to you from the station's reserves." "Negative, Exarch," Thorn's voice came back, strained now, punctuated by the sound of alarms and shouting in the background. "We don't need your power. We need you to record this. We need you to see. This is what we are. We don't shine. We endure." A massive shockwave rippled through the sector as the asterisk Yamato II detonated its remaining nuclear stockpile in a suicidal charge into the heart of the tide's central node. The explosion was blinding, a miniature star born and dying in seconds. When the glare faded, the central mass of the enemy was gone. The surviving tendrils, leaderless and scattered, began to dissipate, their energy lattice unraveling without the central intelligence to maintain it. The silence retreated. The stars returned. In the sanctum of echoes, there was no cheering. There was only a profound, stunned silence. The delegates looked at one another, then at the screen where the remnants of the human fleet drifted amidst the debris field. The sleek, beautiful ships of the Concordat remained untouched, safe behind the wall of human iron. The junk had saved them. The primitive humans had done what the masters of the universe could not. Valkor ordered his personal shuttle prepared. He did not send a transmission. He did not send a subordinate. For the first time in his 400-year reign, the High Exarch of the Cygnus Dominion left the sanctum to stand on the deck of a foreign vessel. The journey to the asterisk Unsk Everest was short, but it felt like a voyage across an epic. As his shuttle docked with the human flagship, the contrast was jarring. The docking bay was not a clean, sterile field of light. It was a cavern of scratched metal, smelling of hydraulic fluid, sweat, and burnt carbon. The air was heavy, the gravity slightly higher than comfortable. Humans in greasy jumpsuits moved with purpose, welding patches over hull breaches, carrying crates of ammunition, their faces smeared with grime but their eyes burning with a fierce, exhausted pride. Ambassador Thorn met him at the airlock. The human looked older than he had on the screen. He was leaning on a cane, and there was a bandage wrapped around his forehead. He did not bow. He extended a hand, a primitive gesture of greeting. Valkor, after a moment's hesitation, extended his own manipulator and grasped the soft, fleshy hand of the human. "Exarch," Thorn said, nodding. "Admiral," Valkor replied, his voice echoing in the cramped corridor. "I have come to offer the gratitude of the Concordat, and my apology. We judged you by the age of your tools, not the strength of the hands that wield them. We called you obsolete." Thorn chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "We are obsolete, Exarch, in a way. Look around you." He gestured to the corridor, where exposed cables hung from the ceiling and steam hissed from a vent. "This ship was built 300 years ago. It was destined for the scrap yard. We keep them in a museum orbit around Mars. We call it the Heritage Fleet. When the call came, we didn't have time to retrofit our modern ships with THE analog dampeners needed to fight your ghost, so we woke up the ghosts of our past." Valkor froze. "Your modern ships," Thorn began to walk, leading the alien leader toward the bridge. "You didn't think this was our navy, did you? Exarch, these are the ships we parade on holidays. These are the ones we tell our children stories about. The Everest is a symbol, a tough one, sure, but a symbol." "Then where?" Valkor struggled to process the implication. If this fleet, this terrifyingly effective fleet of juggernauts, was merely their museum pieces, their cast-offs, where is your actual fleet? The one you use to defend your own space? Thorn stopped at a viewport. Outside, the debris of the battle floated silently. "We are a paranoid species, Exarch. We always have been. We realized a long time ago that the universe is a dark forest, and there are things in it far worse than bad politics. We don't build our main fleet to fight *U* or the Concordat. We build it to fight what comes * after the tide." "After?" Valkor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. "The tide was a scout," Thorn said softly. "A foraging party. It tests the defenses. If it finds energy shields and lasers, it eats them. If it finds resistance, it calls the hunter." Thorn tapped a command into a bulky console on the wall. A holographic projection, grainy and flickering, appeared in the air. It showed a sector of space far beyond the Concordat's borders in the dark void between galaxies. There in the emptiness something was moving, not a cloud, not a ship, but a shape, a geometric perfection of impossible scale. "We call it the Leviathan," Thorne said. "It's waking up. Our deep-range probes picked it up 50 years ago. That's why we stayed quiet. That's why we didn't join your Concordat. We've been busy. We've been building a wall." Valkyoer looked at the human with new eyes. He saw not a primitive savage, but a guardian, a species that had voluntarily walked into the mud so that they could stand firm when the storm came. The humans hadn't been hiding because they were weak. They had been hiding because they were preparing for a war the rest of the galaxy didn't even know was coming. "The fleet you see here," Thorne continued, "the obsolete fleet. It was the only thing that could stop the scout without alerting the hunter to our true capabilities. If we had used our energetic weapons, the Leviathan would have locked onto us. We had to use rocks and fire. We had to play the part of the primitive." "You sacrificed thousands of your people," Valkyoer whispered. "You threw them into the fire just to keep a secret." "We bought time," Thorne corrected. "For us and for you. Now the scout is dead. The Leviathan is blind again. But it will come eventually." They reached the bridge. It was a chaotic hive of activity, but there was a discipline to it. Men and women worked at stations that looked like they belonged in an industrial revolution factory, pulling levers and reading analog dials. But in their eyes, Valkyoer saw the same steel that coated the hull of the ship. "So," Valkyoer said, straightening his posture, "the Concordat is in your debt. We have technology, resources, energy, but we lack this grit. We lack the ability to fight in the dirt. What do you require of us?" Thorne looked out the viewport at the stars. "We don't want your technology, Exarch. We have our own different path, but we can't hold the wall alone forever. We need logistics. We need materials. We need you to keep the lights on in the galaxy while we stand in the dark. We will be your shield, but you have to be the supply line." The implications were staggering. The political balance of the galaxy had shifted in a single hour. The ancient empires, the lords of light and energy, were now dependent on the masters of iron and fire. The hierarchy had been inverted. The primitives were the protectors. "I will convene the Synod," Valkyoer said solemnly. "There will be resistance. The Thalorians will not want to admit dependency. The Kale will be insulted. But they saw what I saw. They saw the tide break against your hulls. We will agree to your terms." Thorne nodded. "Good, because we have a lot of work to do. And Exarch." "Yes, Admiral. Next time you invite us to a party." Thorne smiled, a tired, genuine smile. "Don't be surprised if we bring the good china. You haven't seen what humanity can do when we actually start trying." As Valkyoer walked back to the airlock, his mind was racing with the philosophical weight of the revelation. The galaxy had spent millennia chasing the ethereal, the weightless, the pure energy of existence. They had sought to transcend matter. And in doing so, they had made themselves vulnerable to the very nature of the universe. The humans had gone the other way. They had embraced matter. They had dug their heels into the physical reality, mastering the heavy, the dense, the real. They were the anchor in a galaxy that was drifting away. The shuttle detached, and Valkyoer watched the UNSC Everest recede. It was ugly, it was scarred. It was a brick flying through the Cathedral of the Stars, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Back in the sanctum, the atmosphere had changed. The despair was gone, replaced by a nervous, electric energy. The delegates were arguing, shouting, analyzing the censored data of the battle. They were terrified, yes, but they were alive. Valkyoer ascended the dais. The room fell silent. "The humans," the Thalorian delegate asked, his voice quivering. "Are they leaving? Did they demand tribute?" "They are staying," Valkyoer announced, his voice booming with a newfound strength. "And they did not demand tribute. They demanded partnership. They have unveiled a truth to us today, my fellow counselors. We thought ourselves the masters of the galaxy because we could build towers of light. But a tower needs a foundation. We have been building on clouds." He projected the image of the human fleet, the battered, victorious, obsolete fleet, onto the main dome for all to see. "This is not a fleet of primitives," Valkyoer declared. "This is a reminder that civilizations do not survive by sophistication alone. They survive by will, by the willingness to bleed, by the memory of where they came from. The humans have not forgotten their Iron Age, and because of that, they have given us a future." He looked at the tactical map, at the amber sector of human space that had once seemed so small and insignificant. It now looked like a fortress. "Let the archives show," Valkyoer concluded, "that on this day the galaxy was saved not by the newest weapon, but by the oldest. And let us pray that when the Leviathan comes, the humans are standing between us and the dark." The story of the obsolete fleet would be told for 1,000 generations. It would become the foundational myth of the new Galactic Alliance. Species that had once sneered at kinetic weapons began to retrofit their ships with mass drivers. The aesthetic of the galaxy shifted from the purely crystalline to the ruggedly functional. But more than the technology, it was the philosophy that spread. The idea that nothing is truly obsolete if it still has a purpose, that the past is not weight to be shed, but armor to be worn. High Exarch Valkor lived for another 200 years. He oversaw the Great Integration, the merging of Concordat energy tech with human material engineering. He saw the construction of the Great Barrier Fleet, a joint armada that patrolled the intergalactic void. But he never forgot the moment he stood on the bridge of the Everest, smelling the ozone and the sweat, and realizing that the gods of the galaxy were not beings of light, but weary old men in steel ships, holding the line simply because no one else could. In the end, the galaxy did not look at humanity with fear nor with condescension. They looked with awe, for they realized that while they had been playing amongst the stars, humanity had been guarding the dark, and the dark was deep and full of terrors, but the iron guard of Earth was deeper still. Deep in the void, light years away, the Leviathan stirred in its slumber, sensing the death of its scout. It began to move, a slow, inexorable slide toward the Milky Way. It was hungry. It was ancient. But for the first time in eons, it felt a vibration in the fabric of space that gave it pause. A vibration of heavy metal, of nuclear fire, and of a defiance that tasted of iron. The prey was no longer soft. The prey had teeth. And somewhere in the cold dark, a human admiral lit a cigar, checked the pressure on a steam gauge, and smiled. The wait was over. The real war was about to begin. The silence of the Synod was finally broken, not by debate, but by the sound of industry. For the first time in centuries, the alien forges were lit not to craft art, but to build weapons. The lesson had been learned. The awe was not just in what the humans had done, but in what they had forced the galaxy to become, survivors. And as the asterisk Unsk Everest finally turned its bow back toward the perimeter, trailing smoke and glory, Valkor whispered the final entry into the day's log. Today, we saw the past save the future. Today, the obsolete became the essential. Today, we are all humans. The lights of the station slowly returned to full brightness, but they seemed different now, less ethereal, harder. They illuminated a council that was no longer preparing for death, but preparing for a fight. The diplomatic channels to Earth were flooded with requests, not for aid, but for blueprints, for training, for the secret of the human spirit. And though the humans would share what they could, the one thing they could not export was the history that had forged them. The wars, the struggles, the near extinctions that had taught them the value of a rusty blade in a dark alley. That was tea. Heirs alone. And it was that history, that beautiful, bloody, obsolete history that had just saved the universe. The screen faded to black, leaving only the image of the asterisk Unsk Everest's badge, a simple shield, a sword, and a motto in a dead language. Si vis pacem parabellum asterisk. If you want peace, prepare for war. The aliens finally understood, and the galaxy, for the first time in a long time, felt safe. Not because the danger was gone, but because the monsters on their side were finally awake.